In the second video on ecosystem services, we'll go a little bit further into thinking about ecosystem services and their utility to human well-being. This requires an appreciation of how ecosystem services can help us value ecosystems and the ecological processes that underpins that valuation. Valuation can amount to a direct estimation of monetary value, but it can also refer to more general notions of existence value and the importance of ecosystem services for future generations. In the first part of this video, I will talk about how we might value ecosystem services, and in the second part, I will focus on issues of trade-offs of those ecosystem services with total economic valuation. It is then possible to connect the biophysical structure of an ecosystem with the underlying processes important for their service. These are not always obvious, but essential for the appreciation of the concept. A follow-up slide of that presented in video 1 of this session is how the biophysical structure of the ecosystem, along with its biodiversity, applies to ecosystem function. That then supports services for human well-being, including, if appropriate, the use of economic value. As a utilitarian concept, ecosystem services has a strong link to the economic value of ecosystems. So ecosystem services can be used to estimate different types of value and different types of monetarized value. So these can range from a use value, the direct or indirect benefits derived from natural resources, and from that there are methods to provide a total economic value, usually done to support decision making or to highlight costs and benefits that can easily be overlooked, such as the economic cost of pollution or the costs of habitat conversion. Direct and indirect and option values clearly connect with a range of ecosystem services, as we have previously discussed. Direct use are goods that can be used or extracted from an ecosystem. These can apply to, for example, ecosystem or wetland products, or the amenity that those ecosystems provide. Indirect use value derived from the services that the environment provides, such as the regulating services dependent on ecosystem function. Option value is the value attached to maintaining an option into the future to take advantage of the use value at a later date. Non-use values are benefits provided which do not involve using it directly or indirectly at the moment. This includes the mere fact that something exists, the existence value. So while not all values can be monetarized, there are a variety of techniques that can be used. It is beyond the scope of this session to run through those techniques, but good further reading can be found in Russi et al., the reference which is given in this slide. So from that report by Russi et al., I have extracted a summary of some of the monetary values of different categories of wetlands. These range from coastal systems, mangroves and tidal marshes, inland floodplains and swamps, marshes and peatlands, and rivers and lakes. And what the authors did was they extracted from the literature a range of estimates based on provisioning services, regulating services, habitat services, and cultural services to come up with a range of values, both a minimum value for each of those services from the reports and literature, and a maximum value. And one thing I'd like to draw our attention to is that the range between the minimum value and the maximum value in some cases can be considerable. This is based on a number of reasons. One is the location of the wetland itself, and secondly, on the methods that may have been applied to make those estimates. If we look at one example, the coastal wetlands in China, removing or degrading those wetlands have had serious impact on biodiversity and the economies that they support. The coastal wetlands in China account for less than 1% of all ecosystem area in the country. Yet estimated value of ecosystem services provides $200 billion per year, or 16% of the total value of ecosystem services. A good example of the hidden costs of habitat conversion can be found if we look at the conversion of mangrove forests to shrimp farming. On the face of it, on the left-hand side here, converting a mangrove forest to a shrimp farm enterprise looks as if it has highly attractive economic gains. The commercial profits from the shrimp farming far exceed that from an equivalent area of profits from the intact mangrove forest. However, if we also now consider the subsidies, which are unseen in the background to enable that shrimp farming enterprise, you can see that quite a lot of the profits actually are derived initially from the subsidies to help convert the mangroves. And if we also then add the importance of those mangroves as a fish nursery, which then provides, for example, offshore fishing and an offshore fishery, then the economic cost benefits look fairly marginal between the conversion of the mangrove to the shrimp farm and retaining the natural habitats. Now, if we put in some estimates on top of that on potential storm protection that those mangroves provide for property, then the balance sheet looks very different. And suddenly, rather than looking like an attractive option to convert mangroves to shrimp farms, when we consider these other factors and also the restoration costs that would be implied with damage from the removal of those mangroves, then it clearly doesn't make any economic sense in terms of total economic value of the ecosystem to convert the mangrove forest to shrimp farming. Economic assessment, of course, is only one component that can be used to assess ecosystem services. And like all assessment techniques, it needs to be applied in an appropriate context with an appropriate realization of the pros and cons of that valuation. What is very much needed is a decision-making process to guide judgments on ecosystem conversion and the benefits derived from those ecosystems from ecosystem services. And if we look at the general techniques or the general sense of how do we value an ecosystem as opposed to valuation, we can see at the bottom of this pyramid a process of anthropocentric and intrinsic value. And then we can think about the range of ecosystem services derived from biodiversity. We can try to quantify that in various ways. We can first of all think about qualitative indicators, which indicators of ecosystem services help us make those decisions. And we can think of quantitative indicators where we start putting solid units on the value of the ecosystem. And eventually that value of the ecosystem can be converted to monetary valuation. Now, many of these lower tiers of this pyramid are non-specified ecosystem services, and these increase as we go up the pyramid. Assessing the qualitative benefits and the quantitative benefits, the effort to do that gradually increases up the pyramid. And that explains why there's a relatively low number of monetary valuation exercises globally, but quite a lot, of course, of general sense of the value and the importance of ecosystem services. So when we convert a wetland into something else, we are making a decision about trading assets. And those decisions of trading assets can be made sometimes locally, or they can sometimes be made externally, sometimes many miles or a long distance from actually the wetland itself. So we can think of the proximate causes and the underlying causes of the conversion of wetlands, of which there are many. This paper by Assel et al. In 2013 provides a very good summary of the motivations and the links between the underlying causes, the underlying drivers, and the proximate causes, the proximate drivers, sometimes known respectively as the indirect and the direct drivers. So institutional factors, population growth, economic growth, technological innovation, a lack of awareness, cultural reasons, and tourism and recreational developments can all be underlying causes for a conversion of a particular wetland. And that wetland conversion may be for urban settlement, industrial development, infrastructure, agriculture, pasture expansion, peat extraction, wood extraction, etc. And natural causes can also cause a conversion of a wetland, often driven these days by climate change. If we look at the agricultural development aspect, a prime example for the conversion of wetlands relates to agriculture and the demand for more food. And this quote from the Food and Agricultural Organization sums up the problem in a very succinct way. Satisfying the expected food and feed demand will require an increase of global food production of 70% by 2050, involving an additional 1 billion tons of cereals and 200 million tons of meat. So the challenge of producing more food is very stark, and the conversion of wetlands, of course, is an attractive option. So what is the net value of conversion? And I also want to illustrate this with a couple of wetlands in Kenya. The top left picture here is an intact papyrus wetland, and the bottom left-hand side is a government subsidized rice conversion of a wetland to rice production. And the top right picture is a local community's conversion of a wetland in a piecemeal fashion. So government subsidized rice growing on the shores of Lake Victoria motivated the other local communities to embark on their own conversion of the papyrus swamp. Customary use of the wetlands lies with groups of families who own land through inheritance. Conversion of the papyrus swamps to rice paddies, therefore, needed agreement among family groups for each patch of wetland. Local hydrology meant that draining for the conversions had to proceed from the periphery of the wetland to the center of the wetland, and it needed cooperation across the various stakeholders who had involvement in that wetland. While many community members appreciated the traditional value of the wetland and also its use for informal harvesting of papyrus as a provisioning service, collective action favored the potential of income from rice over traditional use. Grander notions of regulating or cultural services or the loss of livelihoods of the papyrus harvesters were either not considered or viewed as a reasonable trade-off. And that's just a small example of a global problem. Relative to a baseline of 1970, the extent of wetlands around the world continues to decline, with an associated loss of the ecosystem services they provide. That decline from the 1970s also coincides with the resolution under the Ramsar Convention, global resolution to protect wetlands. So despite awareness at a global scale, the extent of wetlands and therefore the services they provide continue to decline. And so the conversion of wetland requires decisions. Those decisions, as I've stated, can be made and driven by local circumstances, or they can be driven by external circumstances. The external drivers, of course, are always translated on the ground by local decision makers who are responding to very often to those external drivers. So water and wetlands provide important ecosystem services, and the values of those services can be captured in different ways. But the knowledge that we have of wetlands and the knowledge that we have of the importance that they have for ecosystem services are often overlooked when it comes to decision making. So policy design and greater awareness, both at policy levels and at local levels, can help try to incorporate at least the importance of the ecosystem services that wetlands, or in the broader sense, swamps, lakes, and rivers can actually provide, and the economics that is associated with those services can be a very powerful component of decision making. And that is important for both the design of policy and the implementation of policy. So choices of converting of a wetland is a matter of trading various ecosystem services with each other. This diagram, this conceptualization from de Groot et al. In 2010, provides a neat summary of the issues we're considering. So if we think about an intact wetland, this will have high biodiversity and it will have a high level of ecosystem service. Now, as that wetland is used and as the system is converted from a natural system to the provisioning service, then the provisioning service, of course, increases, which is this red line in the middle, until there's a certain maximum of provisioning service, and then there is a decline of that service. The exploitation of the wetland, the trade-off between natural capital and economic or social capital, reaches a peak, and then there can be a rapid decline. The regulating service we can conceptualize as being high when the use of the wetland is low. Everything is working in a fairly natural way, and ecosystem processes are functioning in a way which the various plants and animals are adapted to. And as the provisioning service increases, and as the use of the wetland increases and the biodiversity declines, then the maintenance of those regulating services are also impacted. So we can consider that the regulating service declines steadily with increased conversion from high biodiversity to a low biodiversity situation. Now, for the cultural services, CR here is the cultural recreation use. We can imagine that with moderate use of the wetland, that is of course translated into increased use by people, and therefore an increased cultural service. But at a certain point, when the wetland becomes intensively used or degraded, the attractiveness of that wetland for recreation declines. And similarly, when we think about the value of knowledge for that wetland, then classically we can recognize that the description of ecosystems is based on a non-human and non-anthropocentric viewpoint. People are often not in the center of the classic ecosystem models. And of course, then the notion then is that in terms of information and knowledge, then we derive most of our knowledge from intact systems, which may or may not be a contentious point. But in this diagram, the information service also declines with increased use. A combination of all of these different service relationships to the total ecosystem service level is that we can see with moderate use a total increase in the ecosystem service level, followed by a decline as use increases. So the situation is far from straightforward. The situation requires consideration of the different trade-offs and how those trade-offs feed in to management, and how can we use indicators and techniques to help that management, which will be a feature of the second part of this session on ecosystem services. Okay, thanks very much for listening.